Thanks, Brad. Zaynab El Bernoussi holds degrees from Columbia University, PhD Catholic University Louvain, and is at Sciences Po in Rabat International University. Has long worked on dignity in the Egyptian Revolution, is part of the International Studies Association, the Global South Caucus. By the way, Zaynab, will you be in Nashville?
No, I'll be connecting with you in Nashville. I'll be at ISA, but unfortunately I couldn't, arrange to make it. Yeah.
And Zaynab holds that the non-material is not immaterial and poses the question, can we measure the non-material? And I think, Zaynab, that you also have a degree in finance. Finance is typically something that is non-material in certain ways, with a very material, measurable status. Can dignity be part of a development index? The UNDP, Human Development Index, has been working on this for a long time, has tried to include freedom and so on and so forth. Some things work, some things haven't worked. I'm also glad that Paul Bowles, Northern British Columbia University, is joining us and will also make comments. Thanks very much. Welcome to you all, and a cordial welcome to Zaynab in Rabat. Bienvenue.
Merci, thank you, appreciate. All right, well, let me just first share my slides with you. So hopefully that can be a way to, maybe just highlight some points. Well, thank you, dear Stian, for this generous introduction and for having me. A big thank you to Brett Aho here with us for helping me so much in preparing for this event, notably the very awesome, I must say, flyer that looks like, I thought, a cool album cover. And also a thank you to all the staff who support the UNC Santa Barbara Global Studies Colloquium. Thank you to all of you attending here today. And of course, last but not least, a very, very special thank you to my class of International Political Economy from Al Khawain University in Morocco, who are here with us. It is such an honor for me to be joining this series and to interact with the living legend, Jan, who represents to me a truly global scholar like nobody. I had the chance of having your very caring and constructive commenting on a paper a while ago. So if you remember, joint venture universities in China and the Arab world. And not only you were keen on sending me really relevant information that helped me a lot, but you also allowed me and my students to join this series, which we really all benefited from that in our class. So in this talk, as you see, we had these 3Ds and a suggestion of a new index that I'll be talking about. So what I'll be doing is first starting with an introduction of the background to my study. Then I'll give some literature relevant to my inquiry of the concept of dignity, and then my major findings in this study, and particularly in the use of the survey that I'll be talking about. So the findings, because of the survey, have created a foundation for a suggested analysis of what I coined here, the 3Ds. So dignity, democracy, to further the goals of a new development index that focuses on dignity. So first, regarding the problem that led to this research. And before I move to the Arab uprising, so this is from Tahrir Square, First, I just prior to that, I was a graduate student thinking about my dissertation and thinking about well, measurable issues of development in the global south. So issues of poverty, governance, human rights, security. And my own experience studying these issues was much influenced by the 2011 Arab uprising. So not only the surprise of it, but also how it connected also to maybe some well, long-lasting demands, so particularly of here dignity, but well, collective versus an individual one. That is something that I found. I argued in my work that there is a specific historical contextualization of Arab dignity that is essential to embed to projects of democratization and economic development in the region. I believe it's important to look at these 3Ds because they are desired by many people in the region and they have been a recurrent demand. So for instance, in the 1956 Suez Canal nationalization symbolized by Nasser with his image as a symbol of dignity. And here I'm using this example because to me, what was also marking was to see the reuse of this symbol of Nasser as dignity in 2011, when those were very, very different moments, right? But also in other key events preceding 2011, so for instance, the 28th Gafsa protest in Tunisia and other also major protests, particularly regarding economic precarity. Now, to be a bit more specific about my previous work, and here with this slide, I'm referring to my book On Demands of Dignity, or Karama, which is dignity in Arabic. I want to highlight that the demands of dignity recognition that I looked at relate to an ontological insecurity, meaning related to identity. So that was one major theme that I thought was very telling of something quite unique about those demands at that time. For many individuals, that needs to be understood and explained, particularly at the level of institutional decision-making, to provide better fitting programs for social and political cohabitation. The demand of dignity is insightful because it can be tied to recognition. So this amplifies how much such calls for dignity in protests attract attention because they scream, "I am here." So they have this ability to signify many things. So as I said, you had the centrality of something about dignity and Arab identity, but there were also key themes of dignity as faith, of course, as a human right, as materiality, so jobs, money. And this ability to signify many things at the same time allows for the so-called politics of dignity as a catch-all political demand that can serve varied interests simultaneously. So the omnipresence of demands for dignity in many social contexts, and here I want to make the point that those demands are sensationalized in big times of protests, but they are also sort of omnipresent when we look more closely. And they can help us understand the strong resonance of such demands and how they replicate in other cases of contentious politics. So in our global context of really accelerated globalization forces, globalization is not only a force of homogenization, as noted by Jan Scholt, among others, but also as one in which we can see cultural precarities creates a third space of hybrid features which often create similar political experiences that as they often also connect to a global political economy. And this is something also clearly noted in Jan's work. The idea with this study now on a global understanding of dignity and the survey for an index was to look at dignity per context and show that dignity has a meaning in context. So for instance, many respondents in Colombia in 2017, so that was the year of the survey, talked about dignity as something linked to transitional justice because that was a marking feature of their time back then, because of the peace process with the FARC. Now regarding some more on the background and regarding some relevant literature in social studies that addressed issues of politics of dignity. So in sociology, the work of Asif Bayat is paramount regarding the importance of moral outrage in triggering revolutions. There is also the recent collaborative work of Michel Lamont on the recognition gap that is useful to provide evidence that marginalization is damaging and could be tackled via inclusive policies. In development studies, Martha Nussbaum work on capacity building has been remarkable in shedding light on non-material dimensions of well-being, as we were just discussing with Jan, which includes values of dignity and respect, and which also try not to pigeonhole maybe this capability approach in a single metric, right? Though, of course, there was a bit of an attempt to do that with HDI, with the Human Development Index. Dignity is also often studied in terms of how it evolved as part of human rights institutions. Seeking work is notable there, and also Pheng Cheah, particularly regarding this incompatibility between a global capitalist context and the genuine expansion of a society of human rights. In political study, the work of also, again here, Nussbaum on the potency of politics of dignity in her book, The Monarchy of Fear, published in 2018, was, I think, is really important because it talks about this reemergence of a neo-populist, populist discourse since the Trumpian era, and how, well, we are also seeing that mechanism of, solidarity without consensus, right? So similar to that idea of a catch-all demand, right? So there is this sort of unifying force of fear, even if the sources of fear are very, very different, right? There is also the work of Kateb, George Kateb, who was more explicit on the importance of human dignity to strengthen the political claim of human rights and achieve a better democracy. And lastly, Sami Zemni, who worked particularly on the Arab uprisings, brought an important insight on the need for what he called a moral economy in the context of predatory practices in business and even in public administration in the Arab region that were facilitated under neoliberal policies for development, and that led to those demands of dignity. So here, linking the demand of dignity with this dearth of a moral economy. In psychology, there is the groundbreaking work of Donna Hicks, who really informed here my approach, and who's, as a conflict resolution expert, noticed the damaging power of dignity wounds, particularly when dignity is not honored. As dignity violations, so this is here from her work, her research, so it showed that it triggered the same parts of one's brain than those stimulated by physical pain. Another central work can be seen in philosophy with Michael Rosen's analysis of the concept of dignity that boils down to an invitation to commit to dignity as a code of conduct. So here he wants really that we focus on that. So treating people with dignity rather than sort of thinking about defining or agreeing on one definition, because that would question worth, and or actually agreeing on whether there should be sort of a universal worth that is then something that he sees as very likely to bring more contention, right? In law, the seminal work in constitutional law, to be more specific, of Erin Daly on dignity right is really important. So she surveyed various but similar uses of the concept of dignity as a legal right around the world, showcasing how it is operationalized in courts. And what influences, for instance, the jurisprudence regarding how dignity would be addressed in different court cases. So there, such use of dignity as a legal concept owes much to its anchoring in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is international law. So oftentimes we find, of course, a use in domestic law, right? So local law, but then oftentimes there is also that attachment to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as really a clear source of this anchoring of dignity as part of human rights. There has also been an increasing interest in dignity rights in light of several movements demanding or focusing on this demand. So notably the Black Lives Matter movement, which is very inspiring to us, especially for us outside of the US. And there, what we are seeing is this, that's giving attention to a dignified process of judicial accountability is something that is needed to move forward or to move towards, a more decent society where human rights are respected. So, for instance, not approaching here the movement as in its cause of course, the centrality of Black lives, but also of all that comes with it, right? So, for instance, in terms of the judicial process, right? The penitentiary, right? Or treatment of individuals in the penitentiary. So these sort of also linkages. Here, I would like also to bring to attention works in critical security studies regarding the rise of humanitarian security regimes, particularly in the precarious global south, which are alarming regarding a disregard of human life, right? So here, proning the cause of security over individual rights. So there is notably the work of Mark Duffield and your fantastic UC Santa Barbara scholar, Paul Ammar. So a big shout out to him. So now I'll move to talk about the survey. The online survey used for this study invited what I call here information donors. So our study participants, and a big thank you to all of them, from very different places around the world. So this map here represents where they were from. And the questions were about their understanding of dignity, and also invited them to input their suggestions for creating a measurement of human dignity. As I said, this was conducted in 2017, between April and December. I was the principal investigator of this study, and I was assisted by our research intern at Al Akhawain University, the fantastic Khairul Nisa Usman from Indonesia. So a big shout out to her. I must also quickly highlight the generous support of my institution back then, helping me conduct this study, so Al Akhawain University. The survey helped grasp the differences and similarities in understanding dignity in a global context. So there were some really interesting features that emerged in terms of also where the understanding was coming from. There were 105 respondents from 35 countries, so the countries represented here. Now regarding, more information about the donors. So the group was quite diverse in terms of origin, with a slightly higher representation of women. Given the connection, my connection to university groups, most donors, so they were from my networks, so mostly university students, which represented the majority of people aged 40 years old or younger, so mostly younger people. Given that the study was conducted from Moroccan university, with strong ties with the United States, and particularly the liberal arts community, so because it's also Al Akhawain is a liberal arts college. A majority of the respondents were based both in Morocco and the United States. There was also a significant representation of students from Colombia because of my professional ties there. And in terms of what they, what they were doing. So the majority were people from academia, but there were also people that I tried to get from outside this world, right? So engineers, web developers, managers, consultants, NGO workers. So regarding now the questions, so there were 10 questions. So some trying to, here get information on the respondents, right? But then there were questions about events that personify dignity. So here, some of the answers were Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Václav Havel, Álvaro Uribe. So you can see here the image, the pictures. Justice Bob Ferguson, who for the note challenged Trump's racist travel ban. Some answered no one. Jesus Christ, Mohamed Bouazizi, the Tunisian vendor who set himself in fire in the start of the Arab Spring. Mohsin Fikri, so in the case of Morocco, a fish vendor in northern Morocco who was killed by a fish grounding machine when trying to get back his seized fish. The ultras, Martin Luther King, Aisha Shinna, an activist in Morocco advocating for the rights of single mothers and abandoned children, a very controversial cause here. Barack Obama, King Hassan II of Morocco, Malala, King Mohammed VI, Nelson Mandela, and I thought that was, quite funny. A respondent said that they rather present a figure that does not personify dignity, and that was Nicolas Sarkozy. Regarding events that represent dignity, some of the recurring answers were World War II resistance, women's voting activism, the Queen March. So this is that was in solidarity for the decolonization of Western Sahara. Independence Day, so for instance, of Indonesia, animal rights activism, and there were some really specific examples given there, right? So for instance, someone talking about a very specific episode where this very specific company that bred dogs for vivisection was successfully closed down. Great Pride, Columbia's peaceful process, as I mentioned, and here naturally for university students, graduation, Obama's presidency. So you have the examples there. Now, in terms of defining dignity generally, so then there was a question about defining dignity generally, and then defining dignity for you. A majority, so here more generally, a majority associated it with recognition and respect. The donors also referred to dignity as something basic. So here, good treatment, refusing to give up. So here I'm quoting some of the answers: avoiding demeaning our wild nature, being well educated, respect, self-determination, excellence, never putting yourself down, personality, identity. And several respondents also recognized that they don't know how to define dignity, right? So that was also quite an answer that came up significantly. And that they would rather also use what it's not. So there were also these examples. So for some, it was easier to use sort of a negative approach of saying what it's not. So for instance, someone answering that what it's not is Trump supporters burning a mosque. So that was, again, a very, very specific example. When defining one's own dignity, a majority did so in a way that was, that was something that we came out with as a categorization of either an intrinsic understanding or an extrinsic understanding. And also overall, there was generally an agreement that it has to be, it is a human right. Regarding the question about components for a possible dignity index, so there we also asked first to we asked the respondents to also see whether they want to include elements from the Human Development Index. So it's not to say that we sort of just told them to use the HDI, but we sort of invited them to use the HDI, for instance, in that suggestion of an index. And as you know, this is a composite measurement of health, income, and education. And despite that, that came back again. The majority then included almost the whole model, right, of the HDI with these 3 components. But some also were keen on being more specific. So, for instance, specifying that it's the need for healthcare, right? In health, it's social security, power, right? In terms of political rights, quality of life, identity, and for some, which wasn't really clear, even geographic location. In addition to the data collected, I also had the chance to talk with our study donors, and the discussion on dignity that the survey triggered, which quickly veered towards political demands, was oftentimes connected to what was happening in their very immediate context, right? So particularly in terms of the political climate around them. The surveys focus on development issues. So again, thinking about here the biases that also the index prompted, also channeled the discussion to evaluate whether actually dignity should or should not even be an integral part of development. So there was also some really interesting discussion with the donors. So particularly thinking that so seeing there a almost stark contrast with some very much thinking that it should not be even discussed in terms of development, that it's too personal, whereas some seeing that it's actually very relevant to a measurement of development. Many reactions were that also dignity is something fundamental to a human condition, whether it is personal or public, in that sense that it should be some part of this institution of development. When it is more personal, it is thus an understanding of a more endogenous understanding of development, versus one that seemed to be more about material capabilities, right? Again, here just highlighting that contrast between whether it is intrinsic or extrinsic, and of course sometimes seeing how it's both. That was much related to also a affirmation that dignity is inalienable of what makes humans, right? So that I thought was very, very important to see emerge, versus one that's thought that it's about a status, right? About actually gaining dignity, right? Rather than seeing it as innate. The survey data showed a recurrence in distinguishing between, as I said, this intrinsic and extrinsic, but also the look at the 3Ds stemmed from the observation of a capacity in demanding dignity to propel the other Ds, right? So seeing how when demanding dignity, it is oftentimes a diagnosis of something else, right? That is more specific. And that's, I think, is really interesting to see how there is this potency of the demand of dignity to bring attention, right? So particularly in context of unrest, where there is contention, but I think also in context where there are these issues of democracy and development, particularly because how dignity sort of highlights or amplifies, right, those demands. For example, at the time of 2017, I mentioned there was the peace process in Colombia, but there was also this expression of how it is important to right the wrongs, righting the wrongs, and that is integral in the peace building process. And here I would like to highlight the important work of Sandra Rios Oriola on the subject. And then a dignity approach was very much appreciated, right? So not only here this idea of an index, but also just thinking about dignity that the survey invited the respondents to do. Because that approach was seen as quite essential, right, in that process of transitional justice. And it allowed for a way of operationalizing dignity, right? That was also maybe easier to capture as a clear use of the concept and clear utility of the concept. Regarding the connection between dignity and democracy, this can be seen with how fair institutions of governance that respect people are seen as agents of dignification. Again, that was something that Sandra Rios Oriola on working on Colombia talked about, how that's so a part of the transitional justice is also to be treated in a dignified way. So, for instance, in a democratic system, people are more dignified, but we should not say that in authoritarian systems, people do not have dignity. because here we run the risk of depriving them from an entitlement to the useful dignity approach, right? Then seeing how it enables, right, to have such positive treatment. By seeing democracy as a process of dignification of individuals, there is also a recognition of the importance of democracy to favor a context of emancipated dignities, right, in their possible different understandings. It's also noteworthy here to say that in my exchanges with respondents in the study, I heard sometimes things like, we don't deserve the democracy. We need to be educated and disciplined first before we get to democracy, as if democracy is an end and not a means to an end. And such an attitude that seems also a bit self-deprecating of human capabilities then means that it postpones democratic development and misses the opportunity to use it for development concerns. In terms of the connection between dignity and development, this can be seen with economic welfare in the sense of having a job, housing, and what can be considered a dignity of living. The 3Ds here with those connections had been really sort of articulated in these different forms in 2011 in the Arab regions and afterwards. But people there also protested, I mean, in a central way, the precarity of economic life. And again, remember, in the context of increasingly neoliberal friendly government policies, which often and increasingly sacrifice social welfare for the lure of more efficient corporate mechanisms, in which individual clientelist bargain may lead to a premium, right? So there is that lure. If we zoom out of the Arab context, the 3Ds appear to be, ubiquitous, as we said in around the world. So from civil rights movements with the particular interlinking of economic dignity to justice, notably by Martin Luther King, to constitutional processes around the world, including various demands by minority groups. And we find there that the leitmotif of the 3Ds is about a key concern of better living together. And here I'm so referring to the work of Marcus Duvel, published in 2014 on human dignity and how it actually sees its articulation in different contexts. As suggested earlier, there is a current rise in populist narratives that seem to address the ongoing ills of precarity, particularly rising inequalities, in which we may see significant changes in the political processes and maybe a reinventing of both development and democracy. So what do people want, right? Is it regular jobs or new alternatives like a basic universal income? I think choice may be the answer because choice is valued. So for instance, having choice in accepting or refusing economic incentives to deal with precarity and in ensuring one's well-being and happiness. So now regarding, the survey in terms of trying to construct it. And before I do that, I wanted to here talk about some relevant examples. So I mentioned the HDI that I suggested as a way to think of the index, but adding to it, there was also, so here looking at really useful indices out there that try to go beyond the HDI, but that I think are still missing something, right, to sort of defend here my proposal of a dignity index. So before I move to talking here about the MPI, the happiness index, right? I thought it's interesting to look at that example. And one issue is that it's problematic, particularly because it seems to also favor a particular understanding of happiness as self-fulfillment. This is why it's oftentimes ranks Scandinavian countries as in the top levels, right? So that's there again an issue of really sort of bracketing, right, and understanding of the key concepts that is sort of leading that index. So the OFI, the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, directed by Sabina Alkar, grounded actually the MPI on the HDI, right? So that started in the 20th anniversary of the HDI in 2010, and was an attempt to be a bit more intricate, right, in measuring those three categories, right, of income, education, and health. So we see how it is more complex, right, as an index. The OECD Better Life Index, I think it's really a fantastic source of inspiration, because it is very user friendly. So this is, I mean, you can go to the website and check it. And you see there that the composition of the index, so here the elements are housing, income, jobs, community, education, environment, civic engagement, health, life satisfaction, safety, work-life balance. You can actually calibrate each one of these components to what you think is more important, right? And then it would re-rank the countries based on your preferences, right? So the petals there also are proportionate to how much each of these components is achieved, right, for each of these countries. But here the limitation is that this is per only for OECD countries, so it hasn't that global outlook, and it's also it looks at the latest data, so it doesn't allow the users to sort of navigate cross time, right, for to look to actually every time compose, right, their preferences. Lastly, the African Dignity Index, which started last year. This is really exciting. It's an index that is an attempt to measure the progress of the African Union agenda for 2063, particularly regarding its socio-political economic development concerns. It has this three-way problem-solving articulation. So meaning that it looks at outward, inward, so how the world views and treats Africans. Inward, outward, how Africans view and represent themselves to the world. So inward, how Africans view and treat each other, and the intersectionality there, so looking at age, race, gender, social class, ethnic and religious background. So it's really interesting. However, it's very much based on sort of an interpersonal understanding of what is dignity. So it's how it is sort of presented from one side or the other. And of course, it is looking only at the African continent. Now talking about the new index, this is going to be the last point here. Oops, sorry. And you see here this blank map. So I'm gonna invite you to activate your imagination and try with me. The index is under construction, and I'm looking for funding and supports. And I have here identified some tools to do that. So the idea is to try and here include a self-reflection of one's own dignity, to measure to measure dignity in this index. So the question, what is dignity for you? But also those questions raised in the survey of also identifying key events, key people symbolizing dignity, and what should account for a measurement. The index will be then constructed as a form of sentiment analysis. So this is inspired by market research of individual responses for what dignity is and how to measure it. And it will be open to these donors, right, the participants, to feed with information continuously. So the data will be on an online platform, so similar to what you saw with the Better Life Index, where instead of having those petals, right, and that arrangement per country, you will actually be able to hover over the map. So this is using the Tableau interface. And when you hover, it would show either full answers of donors, right? So you can go to that level of specificity, or categorization charts of the answers, right? To see what comes more often, word clouds of the answers. And most importantly, you'll be able to do that while hovering over the map, right? So you'll see differences across location, but also you can pick a year, right? So here, the idea is that it seems that every year this is changing, right? So depending on marking events at the time, so for instance, the US elections, let's think of others, Me Too, the Black Lives Movement as examples, different crises and conflicts. So maybe some last point regarding also operationalization, and this is something that I think was definitely was lacking in the previous survey, is using different languages, particularly to capture different ways of expressing dignity, because that really also matters in terms of understanding. So I'll stop here. Sorry, I took a lot of time. Thank you for your attention, and really looking forward to hearing from you.
Jan, you're muted.
Zaynab, thank you very much. Please, I would like to invite Paul Bowles to kick off our discussion. Do you share an interest in indexes, Paul?
Well, in a strange way. I was trained as an economist, so of course economists spend a lot of time measuring very precisely the wrong thing. So I was very pleased to hear Zaynab's presentation, where she tries to bring in trying to measure some of the right things. And I thought the notion of dignity is something which I think is intuitively very understandable and very appealing, that it is something that we value and that we think is important in our lives and something which we should promote. So I think there's sort of an intuitive understanding of a notion of dignity, to which you added, the academic justification for it too, with a very comprehensive view through various disciplines of why this concept is important. So I enjoyed that, the justification for doing that. I guess when it comes to creating an index as a tool, there are sort of three sorts of questions that one can ask. What are we trying to measure? How are we measuring it? And why are we measuring it? And so I have a few just brief remarks on each of those points. So in terms of what are we trying to measure? So I guess the question is whether when we see in 3D, will we see more of what it is that we want to see? And as you noted, it's a very crowded field for indices out there. There are, at least one for every day of the month. So there's lots of indices out there which could be used, that people are creating. So I think the question is a little bit around how much more would it tell us if we added dignity in to compared with the other indices which you talked about. So you talked a little bit about dignity and work, and the materiality and the precarity of work. The ILO has a whole decent work emphasis and measurements around decent work and what constitutes decent work. There's human security indices. This is not even without mentioning the SDGs. So we have this very crowded field. So I guess the first question is, why do we need another one? What is it that we're missing in all those things that we need to incorporate? So that would be the sort of first question: what to measure. On the sort of how to measure. So I thought it was quite interesting. Obviously, yours was just a sort of pilot project, so we can't really tell very much from 100 respondents, but it was quite interesting. I found it, it's not clear to me what sort of index this is going to look like. Is it going to look like a stock market index, which gyrates up and down every hour, depending on, people's whims or passions, or, how they're feeling, whether they've been humiliated that day or whatever, so is it going to look like that, or is it going to look more like one of these indices which changes much more slowly over time, which we sort of anticipate or expect from sort of development indices in general to be rather slow moving, measuring them changes over decades rather than minutes. So does it matter? I'm just so interested in what you've envisaged this index looking like as a result of that. Some of the more sort of technical issues around whether there are correlations between, dignity and democracy, dignity and education, those sorts of things. Well, that sort of, if they are highly correlated, then we might only need a measure of one of them to tell us what we need. So there are these approaches called principal component analysis, where you can say, okay, which one of these variables, which all seem to be moving the same way, are actually is the most important to include, which tells us the most. Otherwise, if we want to create an index, we don't want 97 different components to it, because it's too difficult, too time consuming to collect. So how do we choose which 3 or which 4 to put in? Well, there's sort of statistical methods to enable you to do that. So, would we expect dignity to be one of those or not? And I guess my third sort of question, why are we doing this? So do you see your index as being aspirational, something that, like the SDGs, tell us something that this is something to which we should aspire? Does it have policy implications? Is it something to drive policy? How do we deal with post-development critiques, which say all we're doing is these indices are creating, as you said at the beginning, hierarchies which point to gaps and deficiencies rather than pointing to strengths of individuals and communities and states or whatever. So how would that sort of play out? So those are sort of 3 sets of questions which were stimulated by your very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Zaynab, please, if you want to respond.
Sure. Thank you very much. Well, for being here and for these very, very engaging comments and questions. And I mean, it's really something that I need to think more about, because it is also a process that I think, or the answering those questions is something that I think will come with also time, trying, right? The also experience of maybe seeing the index out there. But first, regarding what more it can bring, right, to this crowded field of indices, that I mean, definitely I think that we are seeing this multiplicity of indices out there. So why one more? I mean, of course, I think there are maybe, well, definitely issues or problems rising with having this too many indices, maybe seeing this well, distraction of what should matter more, right? If that's a concern, or even also maybe a dilution of resources, right? Thinking about how those indices can be used for particular goals. But and to me, how it could be an invitation to do something different is because the format of looking at how the respondents directly define what is to be measured is something that's many of the indices don't do, right? So what you have there is a bit, even if it's actually using participants, people's answers, right? But it's framing what needs to be measured, right? So there is this very sort of top-down approach to what is to be measured. Whereas here, by using dignity, particularly because it is so wide, to be able to be attached to so many variables, right? Then the process of actually building the index is more bottom up, right? So, but also, I mean, it is very also maybe hard to see how it can consistently help us measure anything, right? But I think, so maybe there, instead of seeing it as a measurement, so that is something also that I need to articulate better, it's a way of trying to express something in these, I mean, in terms of what ought to be a concern for, well, those decision makers, right? So, and there, I think there is a dimension of dignity that I, said that I sort of came out from my previous work, particularly on the identitarian dignity, the identitarian dignity, right? So seeing how it is linked to identity politics. And I think there is a need for more expression of how, that could be something useful in terms of better policy making, right? So how can we get something from these politics of dignity? Because there is much of an expression of that in the concept of dignity, particularly because it's for many, and the index hopefully would do that. So there is that personalized understanding of the concept.
So, Zaynab, I also see questions. The conversation widens by David and Melissa and Marcus. And I may slip in a question too. David, Melissa, Marcus, please.
Thank you so much, Jan, for inviting Zaynab. This is really important, what you're doing. And thank you for highlighting the other indices that are out there as well. My question is how to get publics refocused from GDP and other economic measures This seems to me more important. I mean, of course, those are important, but you know, are we moving to a place in the world, in world history, that might be more focused on human rights in the direction of dignity and so on? I work with marginalized communities in a number of places, and they bring dignity and respect up before they bring up economic deprivation. So this is really important work you're doing, but how can we get the media and so on more focused on these things?
Thank you so much for well, your kind words and this question. And I think I mean definitely I think that there is an attention that needs to be more there regarding these other demands, right, than sort of better attainment in economic variables as a way of what people want. And thinking, for instance, also about, let's say, this idea that there is, are we seeing a progress in human rights? And maybe this is a concern we should have if there is this, well, if people are bringing up dignity as something they need, right? So I think, I mean, I mentioned the work of Catherine Sicking on the development of institutions of human rights. So she talks about how she thinks that overall there is, right? It's if we look really, we zoom out and we look at the bigger picture. So thinking, for instance, about the Arab countries in the Arab Spring, there were these failures, right, of the so-called revolutions, almost these this going back to even more oppressive context, right? So then the question is, well, maybe it failed, those demands of human rights failed, right? But I think even there are those gains of actually the growth of expression, particularly civil society, right? That is really something that cannot be, I mean, taken away. And in terms of bringing more attention to, for instance, those demands, right? I think it needs to happen by, I mean, for instance, yeah, maybe focusing more on these on measurements or on variables, right, of what is how to attain, well, more context where there is more respect for human rights. So there, I think, for instance, also attention to the legal use of dignity, right, is something that the media is actually being more attentive to. So how in the name of dignity, right, we have all sorts of court cases where, for instance, I mean, there was an example that I thought was fascinating of actually being able, in the US, of being able to, well, successfully sue the examining office for the bar exam because, I mean, there was a lactating mother who didn't get extra time to finish the exam, and that the articulation was she didn't feel that it was a dignified process of treating her, right? So this is very specific, but I think it really brings the attention on the importance of these little, I mean, little, but they are quite also big things.
That's interesting, Zaynab. Please, can we carry on questions of Melissa, Marcus, Zaynab? Maybe you combine them and then we go further. Melissa, please.
Hello. Yeah, somebody actually reminded me there, karama is the word for dignity in Darija in Arabic. Thank you. But just very briefly, you talked about fear being a unifying force, even if it comes, those fears come from different sources. And I'm just curious to know if you see focusing on dignity as a measure and index as a way to bring people together around a common ground that's more constructive and productive.
Thank you.
Okay, merci. Combine, please, with Marcus. please.
Thank you so much. Fascinating. I welcome particularly that you ground so really nicely this in the work across several disciplines, that you embrace the outcome of the Fraser Honneth debate that struggles for recognition and redistribution need not be rigidly opposed, and that you push now for turning dignity into an index that I think would be so much better than the dominating one, such as the HDI. 3 little questions, theoretical, methodological, and practical. About index construction, how to handle the issue of the digital divide, that the digital literati can easily participate, but not all the others. Second, for example, white supremacists are seeking dignity while utterly disregarding the dignity of certain others. Think of the argument Jeff Alexander, Maria Pia Lara against Honneth, and the recognition theory, which I think just as well applies here. How do you respond to that in the index construction, or how you roll it out? Thirdly, about the obstacles, how to get it implemented, which connects to David's question, but let me take it in a complementary direction. Who is against it? Why does such a kind of a development index with dignity not exist all along? What has prevented this from occurring over all these previous several decades? And that question might give us some ammunition of like how to overcome those obstacles. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, this is really, very helpful question. Thank you. So should I start again, right?
Yes, please.
So, yes, Melissa, yes, it's Karama. I need help maybe from my students about Tamazirt. I'm not sure, but I think it's also Karama. Regarding maybe seeing, or the question of seeing dignity as a more constructive approach to getting people together than, for instance, okay, yes, Asia is saying that it's the case, thank you. Actually, for instance, fear. I mean, I think it's definitely, I see it as more constructive, and I think it's just more natural to also go for it because it's appealing, and I think Paul for also highlighting that there is something almost naturally appealing about rallying behind dignity, and I think it comes maybe more naturally than fear. However, I don't think it can be prevented if some actually are motivated by what we can sense as fear. So I mentioned some examples where people actually provided answers to understanding dignity in a negative way of what it's not, right? So it is almost as trying to say that this is what I think is the anti-dignity, so humiliation, right? And some form of negative sentiment. So I think that's the fact, yes, that it's maybe sort of taking here the respondent more towards that maybe more positive approach is something that maybe can be more constructive. Regarding, and thank you, Marcus, for your questions. So yes, regarding the digital divide, that's an excellent point. And yes, definitely, maybe they're trying to devise a way in how the index is constructed. So actually, this is definitely something that helps me hopefully improve this proposal. So having a way to capture people beyond those who have the ability to answer, right, through the online platform, right? So definitely it's important. In terms of risks, so if I understood correctly of how, for instance, in the white supremacist discourse, there is that instrumentalization of dignity by sort of taking away the dignity from others and seeing their a coherence. I think that's a quite recurrent model in many other sort of examples. So not only in some sort of ethno-identifying groups. And I think that's, so in terms of how the index would deal with that, I think, I mean, here it's ought to, I mean, well, capture what is there, right? So if that's what is there, then that is an understanding of dignity for some. And I mean, yeah, I think it would be then the way to deal with it. And lastly, regarding the question of the politics maybe behind this delay in seeing a long-awaited integration more of the concept in thinking about development or measurements of development. So there, I think that maybe one key challenge is regarding also the clear legal applicability of dignity. So that is maybe some a way to understand this delay. I mentioned how there are a number of works that surveyed, right, how different courts deal with the concept, particularly when there are these demands. So, and I mentioned the work of Michael Rosen, and he used this really fascinating example of a dwarf tossing competition in France that was banned by a French mayor, but actually the people involved demanded that it was their dignity to do whatever they want with their bodies. But so there was a sort of a clash between an individualized understanding of dignity, of almost autonomy, right, versus one of what is respectable, right? And that is socially, that should be a way of showcasing a respectable society. So yes, I think that tension between those, really the fundamental sort of approach to dignity. Is it something that we should accept to be individualized, or should we operate with an understanding that is more collective, right? Because that way it's just easier, right? It would be just easier pragmatically to do that. So I think because of that, there is a bit of that. I mean, that's a way for me to see maybe a reason for that delay.
Merci, Zaynab. Let's go to William. I would also like to slip in a question. And I also see that Melissa has another remark in the chat. William, please.
Yes, thank you for a very stimulating talk, and so many different aspects that it's tough to congeal the question into one succinct question. But actually, in fact, I have two questions. One is related to the your definition, and at the beginning, and also in doing your survey, I think you mentioned its connection with some of the negative components, so particularly humiliation, but also subordination, or I think in more common parlance, at least in the United States, disrespect or dissing. And so I guess that's the first question, that do you think it's dignity becomes more salient in conditions of conflict or loss, or some kind of ongoing struggle. I mean, obviously, your work comes out of the Arab Spring events as well. So maybe that's an obvious sort of yes, but maybe you could expand on that a little bit. And then also the bigger question, I think, because at the beginning you mentioned briefly that globalization can also, in addition to meaning homogenization, it relates to the feeling of cultural, I forgot how you phrased it, but something about cultural precarities. And so, so dignity becomes again more felt in situations in which groups or local communities feel that political forces are denying them some kind of either rights or any of these other components that you've mentioned. I mean, I think that partly relates to Paul's second category of how, because he mentioned also that, and you've talked about it at various times, that these ideas might fluctuate, and that also came out in your work, that they fluctuate over time and place. So those are the kind of the two questions, and I'll put them in the chat as well. So I don't know if I articulated them very well. Anyway.
Yes.
Thanks a lot, William. So let me also slip in a question. Isn't it interesting that dignity in a certain way is everywhere, already exists, but it becomes a salient issue there where it is damaged, it is denied, it is missing, so that by putting it, trying to put it in an index, we are actually measuring an absence, but seek to put it in a positive sense. And in a certain way, dignity is a measure of power, the ability to influence. Citizens can decide on a budget for parts of the city, as in the Porto Alegre approach. So dignity is a matter of democracy, and the denial of dignity occurs in authoritarianism. Egypt is a situation. Occurs in kleptocracy, oligarchies. Russia is a situation. Occurs in violence and attack. Russia is a situation. Right-wing populism that flourishes by insulting and polarizing and segmenting is a situation. So these are instances of absence and damage. Melissa, I just learned, by the way, you are in Rabat, you are of Fielding University here in Santa Barbara, and you say more positive examples. My question to you then, Melissa, on the side is, or if you want, what are, in your view, positive examples of dignity?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I am living and working here in Rabat, but studying at a university based in Santa Barbara, like UCSB at Fielding. So I'm happy to join the call. For me, I think there are many examples of positive examples of dignity, but I'm struck that, Zaynab, how you're sharing that you found that people had an easier time identifying it or giving examples of what it doesn't look like, which can be helpful when identifying things. But I think also Marcus's question, what has prevented this measurement in this way, and just thinking about a lot of things also, Gregory Bateson's work with schismogenesis and the concept of people moving apart and away from each other, and how whether damaging dignity happens intentionally or otherwise. But I think we have many positive examples of what dignity looks like, and yet since we don't measure it, maybe we're not valuing it enough. So it's a very interesting discussion. Thank you, Zaynab.
Thank you.
Can we combine the degree of presence absence of dignity with varieties of market economies? There is more regard for people's rights, people's dignity in coordinated market economy, in market economies where society and public values have a big place. Zaynab, please, over to you again.
All right, sure. Yeah, I'm glad to hear, Melissa, you're nearby. So I hope, yeah, we definitely hope, yeah, we get to connect. So to answer the question, so I'll go back to William. Thank you for your question regarding a definition. So here I use, and I think it's just in a way that is pragmatic in terms of the particular legal application, because it is important, is of dignity as this so-called self-worth, right? That it is about self-worth. So that then is the sort of basis, right, for all the other human rights. So thinking also of how in the Universal Declaration there isn't an affirmation of dignity as a human right, but as what makes everyone equal, right? But you pointed how it fluctuates, so I definitely just wanted there to raise also that what was interesting in my previous work, particularly talking with protesters, is seeing how it changes even for one person when you go back and ask them, right? So you have those, and I mean, we can think about it also in terms of maybe our own experience, right, through life, how that may be changing. In terms of the question regarding surveying, well, or seeing in the survey that there was this expression of well, what is there when dignity is not there? So humiliation, you talked about dissing, and how it's connected to sort of experiences of conflict. I mean, absolutely, and just to give an example that I thought was also quite maybe revealing, is thinking of how dignity was expressed as faith in the Arab uprisings in Egypt in 2011, particularly in Islam, right? So this expression of dignity as a feeling of being sort of dignified in one's faith, and particularly Islam. And I think that was quite useful, instrumentalized by that Islamist alternative, right, that took power in many of those regimes, right? So there was that really association of we are the alternative. So if that so-called moderate secular regime was the humiliation, right, then we provide the antidote, right? And here to also connect this question with your question, Jan, regarding well, how dignity is also sort of connecting to what is salient. So it's then something else, right? So it's about maybe exercising some form of power, right, to then bring attention to something else. So I think there definitely that is a point that I'm thinking more and more about, as instead of thinking of what is dignity and how we can really see it. Is it something that you have when you are in peace, not in conflict, when there is maybe less violence, where there is a particular type of economy? So I think it is an expression for that. So for instance, I think we might, for instance, expect that we'll see more negative expressions in places where there are, right, all those issues of violence, of conflict, of poverty, right? But I think there is more to that. So I think, yes, there would be those probable, well, trends that we'll expect. But actually, in some discussions I had with colleagues from Tilburg University, we were thinking about actually thinking also of defining dignity as either something that is substituted. So it's either you have it or you don't, right? And then let's say thinking of whether dignity is something that could be, for instance, negative, right? If you don't have enough, right? And then positive when you have, well, what is meant to give dignity, or as actually something that is about complementing, right? So it's, and in there, it's is more of an approach where we accept that it's by definition there, because that is people's worth, right? So there is dignity, but then there is the complement to that. So how much you feel more dignity, right? So you maybe start with a baseline, right, of the minimum, but then in places where maybe you have more, again, those let's say, helpful features to dignity, right? Democracy, the rule of law, right? Then dignity sort of goes higher, right? I think that's probably a more interesting approach to see how it adds up, rather than seeing how it could be negative, right? Where there would be a shortage. Yeah, so.
Thank you very much, Zaynab. I notice we are about at 2 o'clock. Quickly, I want to draw your attention to Sari Hanafi in Beirut, President International Sociological Association, who gave a wonderful talk combining sociology and moral philosophy. It's in our recorded videos. Please have a look. Then Biku Parak, in the last talk of this quarter, we're in a quarter system, will speak on global ethics. I am positive you will like it. We very much like your approach and your problematic. Thank you very much. Thank everybody. Greetings to you all, and have enjoy a very dignified day.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate. Thank you very much.
Merci bien.
Thanks everybody for joining. Next
All right.
week, we're going to be hosting Richard Falk, who is going to be talking about global realignments. So, see you
and he has a lot of dignity.
That he does. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Au
you.
revoir. Merci.